Mom? My baby. I missed you so much.
The last memory Victoria Caldwell had of her mother was the smell of her perfume. Warm vanilla and something faintly floral, the kind of scent that clings to a woman who still believes the world is going to be fair to her. Victoria was 9 years old. She pressed her face into her mother's neck one last time before bed on a Thursday night in October. In a house in the hills outside Austin, where the windows were still warm from the afternoon sun even after dark. Her mother held her a little longer than usual that night. Tighter than usual, not uncomfortably, just with an extra beat of stillness that Victoria felt without being able to name. The way a person holds on to something when a part of them already knows, in the place beneath reasoning and language, that they are running out of time. Victoria did not understand any of that at 9 years old. She only understood that the arms around her were the most certain thing in her small world, and that her mother smelled like warmth, and that Tuesday was show and tell, and she had already chosen what she was going to bring. By Friday morning, Eleanor Caldwell was gone, and the people who took her had planned every single detail. They had paid for it. They had arranged it across weeks of careful preparation. And when it was done, they sat across from that 9-year-old child at a funeral and told her that her mother was in the ground. They looked her directly in the eyes while they said it. They did not flinch. And for 22 years, that little girl believed every word. Victoria Caldwell was 39 years old the morning her world came apart, and she did not see it coming, which is the most important thing to understand about everything that follows. She was not a woman who failed to see things coming. She had rebuilt Caldwell Industries from near bankruptcy into one of the most respected logistics firms in the state of Texas. She had negotiated federal contracts that put her in rooms with people who had spent decades learning how to intimidate people like her, and she had walked out of every one of those rooms with exactly what she went in for. She had appeared on 3 Forbes lists in a row and had sat across from journalists who asked about her success, and had answered their questions with the controlled calm of someone who has learned that the narrative you control is the only narrative that matters. People who worked alongside her used words like precise and relentless and occasionally terrifying, and they meant all 3 as compliments. Not one of them, in the years she had been in business, had ever used the word vulnerable. Not because it was not true, but because the specific architecture of Victoria Caldwell's life had been designed, from the time she was 9 years old standing at a graveside in a dress that was too big for her, to ensure that the vulnerability stayed exactly where she had put it, which was somewhere no one could see it, and she did not have to feel it unless she chose to. She had spent 30 years not choosing to. And on a Tuesday morning in October, a driver took a different route to the airport, and that architecture came down. What Victoria did not know, what had been deliberately kept from her across 22 years with enormous effort and enormous expense, and the cooperation of people she had trusted completely, was that the grief she had been living around was built on a lie. That the car accident had been arranged. That the casket at her mother's funeral had been empty. That Eleanor Caldwell had been alive every single day of those 22 years, moving through Texas cities under a name she had taken from a newspaper obituary, carrying a fireproof box in a bag over her shoulder and a key on a cord around her neck, and 47 printed photographs of her daughter folded inside that box. One for each year she had been able to find one. Because she had made herself a promise in the first terrible year that she was not going to stop knowing who her daughter was becoming, even if she could not be there to see it happen in person. Victoria did not know any of this. She was sitting in the back seat of a black car reading a contract on her phone. And then the car slowed. And then it stopped. And then something happened that changed everything. Marcus had driven for Victoria for 11 years. He knew her schedule and her silences and the exact quality of her concentration when she was deep in a document, which meant do not speak, do not clear your throat, do not exist in any way that draws attention to the fact that you are in this car, just drive and get her there on time. He had taken an alternate route that Tuesday morning to avoid a construction delay that had been backed up on the main road since 6 in the morning. A practical decision, a small one, made without a second thought in the way that hundreds of small decisions are made in the course of an ordinary morning. That decision took them down Meridian Street. At the corner of Meridian and 5th, the traffic light turned red. It turned green. Marcus did not move. He said later in a sworn deposition that he could not explain why he stopped at the green light. He said something made him pause, and he could not put a word to what the something was. He looked in the rearview mirror and he watched his employer, A woman he had never in 11 years seen do anything that was not deliberate and planned, open her car door and step out onto the sidewalk without saying a single word. He put the car in park. He watched. He did not speak. He understood, without being able to say how, that whatever was happening across the pavement was not something he should interrupt. There was a woman sitting against the wall of a closed laundromat on the other side of the sidewalk. She was in her early 60s. Her coat had once been burgundy and had faded over years of weather and wear into something closer to rust. She was holding a paper cup in both hands with the particular careful stillness of someone who is conserving warmth and trying not to draw attention. She was looking at the pavement directly in front of her with the practiced downward gaze of a person who has learned through long experience that making eye contact with the people who walk past is an invitation to being moved along, or being given money with an expression of pity, or being asked questions by someone in a uniform, and none of those things are preferable to simply being left in peace. Victoria crossed the pavement. She stopped in front of the woman and stood there for a moment without speaking, just looking, in the way you look at something when your body has understood something your mind has not yet caught up to. Then she crouched down in her coat on the public sidewalk, and she looked specifically at a small crescent-shaped scar above the woman's left eyebrow. The same crescent scar from the single photograph her father had kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk for 30 years. The photograph he had told a teenage Victoria to put back and not ask about when she found it. Victoria said her mother's name, and the woman sitting against that laundromat wall closed her eyes. And she did not deny it. What came next was not the tearful reunion you might expect. Eleanor Caldwell did not open her arms. She did not say her daughter's name. What she did, in the first seconds after Victoria spoke, was look around the street with a sharp, precise terror that stopped Victoria where she was crouching on the pavement. It was not generic fear. It was the specific practiced terror of a woman who had survived 22 years by remaining invisible and who understood in the marrow of her bones that being seen clearly by the wrong person at the wrong moment could undo every single thing she had quietly endured to reach this particular Tuesday morning. That fear, animal and specific and completely real, in the eyes of a woman who had once been powerful and warm and safe in the world, told Victoria Caldwell everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken between them. Someone had built that fear. Someone had maintained it deliberately, year after year, with enough money and enough reach to make a living woman this afraid of her own visibility. And that someone was not a stranger. That someone was someone who shook Victoria's hand every week in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building that bore her family's name. She did not know that yet on the sidewalk. She was about to find out. And finding out was going to cost her everything she thought she knew about the last 30 years of her own life. Victoria canceled the Chicago flight from the sidewalk. She moved her mother to a private hotel before noon. She paid cash at the front desk and gave a name that was not her own, and chose a hotel she had never used for business and that had no connection to anyone in her professional world. She told her assistant to cancel everything for 3 days and to tell no one where she was and to give no explanation beyond that. Richard Harlow called her phone 3 times that afternoon. She looked at his name on the screen each time the phone vibrated. She declined every call. She had worked with Richard Harlow for 30 years. She had attended his birthday dinners and taken his calls at 11 o'clock at night, when he said it was important, and trusted his counsel on decisions that moved millions of dollars. She had never once declined his call. She declined all 3 that afternoon and turned her phone face down on the hotel room table and sat across from her mother in the 2 chairs by the window, and she listened. Eleanor Caldwell talked for 6 hours without stopping. She started at the beginning. She went to the end. She spoke with the precise, careful order of a woman who had been rehearsing this account inside herself for years. Not out loud, but in the private space where people carry the things they are waiting to be able to say, because she had always believed the moment would come, and she had always wanted to be ready when it did. With every sentence the world Victoria had believed, she was living and reassembled itself around a different and completely devastating truth. Before we tell you what Eleanor said in that hotel room, before we take you inside the fireproof box she had been carrying the key to for 22 years, you need to understand 3 things. You need to understand who erased Eleanor Caldwell from existence and why, and not in the general sense, but in the specific sense of who made the decision, who made the call, who signed the agreement and counted the money, and went home afterward and slept. You need to understand how a living woman ended up sleeping on the streets of the same city where her daughter was running a $400 million company, not for a week or a month, but for years, without a single institution in that city connecting those two facts in any way that led to action. And you need to understand what Richard Harlow knew. Because the answer to that last question is not complicated and it is not ambiguous. Richard Harlow knew everything. He had known everything from the night he picked up the phone and made the first call. He had known for 30 years. And in 6 hours, Victoria Caldwell was going to walk into a Dallas police precinct with a fireproof box full of documentation so complete, so specific, and so carefully preserved by a woman who had never stopped building her case, even while she slept in rented rooms and ate at charity kitchens, that the lead detective on the case would say in a recorded interview afterward that in 22 years on the job, he had never seen anything like it. Not even close. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the spring of 1999, Eleanor Caldwell sat down at her husband's desk in the study of their home in the hills outside Austin to look for a contractor invoice she needed for a home repair estimate. She found instead a vendor name she had never heard in 9 years of marriage: Meridian Logistics Solutions. She wrote it on a notepad because that was simply what she did when she encountered something she did not recognize. She wrote it down and looked into it, the same methodical habit she had carried since college. She went to the public records office 2 days later, while Thomas was in meetings in Houston and Victoria was at school. She pulled the registration documents for Meridian Logistics Solutions. What she found was a Nevada incorporation with no employees, no physical address, no operational history, and no business purpose that she could identify. What she also found was that this company with no employees and no address had received $430,000 from Caldwell Industries in the previous 14 months. Eleanor drove home. She made dinner. She put Victoria to bed. She waited until Thomas was asleep. Then she sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began tracing where the money went after it left Meridian's account. She did this carefully over 3 weeks, using library computers during Victoria's school hours, telling Thomas she was helping a friend plan a fundraiser. When she finally reached the end of the money trail, it led directly into a personal holding account controlled, through a layer of intermediary companies, by Richard Harlow. She sat at the library terminal for a long time looking at what she had found. Then she made copies of everything and drove home and locked them in the fireproof box in the back of the hall closet and waited for the right moment to talk to Thomas. She told Thomas on a Tuesday evening after Victoria was in bed. She laid the documents on the kitchen table between them and told him calmly and specifically what she had found and what it appeared to mean and what she believed needed to happen next. Thomas looked at the documents. He did not touch them. He looked at them for a long time, and his expression during that silence was one Eleanor would describe years later as the face of a man deciding, not discovering. Then he looked at his wife and told her she had misunderstood what she was looking at. He said the Meridian payments were a legitimate consulting arrangement that had not been properly filed, and that he was aware of them and had approved them, and that the documentation would make it clear if she accessed the right system. He told her to trust him. He told her this was not something she needed to involve herself in further. He told her to stop looking. Eleanor sat across from her husband and listened to all of it, and looked at his face while he spoke, and understood, with the specific clarity that arrives when you have finally let yourself see something you have been carefully not seeing, that Thomas was not confused or uninformed or protective of her. He knew exactly what Meridian Logistics Solutions was. He had always known, and he had chosen his arrangement with Richard Harlow over everything else in that kitchen. She packed the documents back into the box. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark beside her husband that night, and she did not sleep, and she did not speak, and she began, with great care and great quiet, to think about what she was going to do on her own. What Eleanor did not know that night, what she had no way of knowing, was that Thomas had called Richard Harlow before she walked into the kitchen that evening. He had told him everything. The vendor name she had found, the library computer visits, the documents she had copied, the appointment she had mentioned to a lawyer friend. And Harlow had listened with the calm of a man who had always known, somewhere in the back of his carefully organized mind, that this moment was a possibility and who had already decided what to do about it if it arrived. He thanked Thomas. He told him not to worry. He said he would handle it. Thomas went home and told his wife she had misunderstood what she was looking at. And Harlow picked up a different phone and called Thomas Whitfield. Whitfield was not the kind of man whose name appeared in any professional directory. He was the kind of man that certain kinds of powerful people had learned to keep in their contacts for situations that could not be resolved through ordinary means, and that required a particular combination of discretion and capability and the willingness to not ask questions about what the situation actually was. Harlow told Whitfield to handle Eleanor Caldwell. He transferred $40,000 through a chain of accounts that would have taken a forensic team months to trace. Whitfield arranged the truck. He arranged for Eleanor's bank accounts to be frozen through forged authorization documents processed by a contact at a financial services firm who had been useful before. He began monitoring her movements through her phone and through Thomas, who reported her schedule without understanding, or perhaps without allowing himself to understand, exactly what he was enabling. Eleanor found the lawyer on her own through a legal aid referral network, taking care to avoid every firm she knew had any connection to Harlow or Caldwell Industries or anyone in their professional world. She scheduled the appointment for a Thursday afternoon when Thomas had a standing meeting in Houston. She gathered her documents. She made a second complete set of copies and sealed them in a padded envelope and mailed them to her sister Dana in Fort Worth with a handwritten note on a single index card that said only, "Keep this somewhere safe and do not open it unless something happens to me." She did not explain further. She did not want to frighten Dana, and she did not want to put more into writing than she had to. On the evening of October 14, 1999, she got in her car and drove toward the appointment. She turned the radio off. She drove through the October dark with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind working through what she was going to say when she sat down across from that lawyer. She had the documents. She had the account numbers. She had 3 weeks of careful notes. She felt, for the first time in weeks, that she was moving toward something instead of simply sitting inside the danger of it. She never arrived. 15 minutes from the office on a dark and unlit stretch of Tulane Highway outside Austin, a black truck with no visible plates came up behind her without slowing and hit her vehicle from behind with enough force to send it skidding sideways across the shoulder and down the embankment on the right side of the road into a shallow drainage ditch below. The impact drove Eleanor's head sideways into the driver's side window. The world went briefly white and then came back dim and wrong-angled. The car was in the ditch. The engine had cut out. Her head was bleeding from a cut above her ear that she could feel more than see. Her left shoulder had hit something in the impact and hurt badly, but she could move the arm. She sat still for a moment. She took deliberate inventory, the way someone takes inventory when panic is available and she is choosing not to use it. Then she looked up through the windshield at the road above the embankment. The black truck was gone. The road was empty. There were no streetlights and no houses visible in either direction and no sound except the distant hiss of the wind through dry grass at the edge of the ditch and the sound of her own breathing. She looked at the passenger seat. Her phone was there, but the passenger door had jammed in the impact and the driver's side door was worse and the embankment above her was steep and her head was bleeding and she made a decision. She did not go back for the phone. She pushed the passenger door until it opened enough to get through. She climbed the embankment using both hands in the gravel. She stood on the shoulder of the highway with blood on the side of her face and glass in her hair, and she looked in both directions at an empty road, and she understood with the complete quiet certainty of someone who has been paying very close attention for a very long time that this was not an accident. The truck had known exactly where she was going and exactly which road she would take to get there. She turned in the direction she judged was most likely to produce a building with a phone, and she started walking. She walked for 2 hours. The highway shoulder was narrow and unpaved, and her shoes were not made for gravel, and she walked anyway, pressing her coat sleeve against the cut above her ear and counting her steps in sets of 100, because counting was something to do that was not thinking about what had just happened or what was coming next. No cars passed. The night was cold and completely quiet except for her footsteps and her breathing and twice the sound of something moving in the brush to her right. She did not stop. After approximately 2 hours, she saw the yellow glow of a gas station sign through the trees ahead. She walked through the glass door, and the fluorescent light was very bright, and the attendant behind the counter looked at her face and asked if she needed him to call an ambulance. She said no. She asked if she could use the phone. He pushed it across the counter without another question. She called Dana in Fort Worth because Dana was the only person in her life who was entirely outside the world of Thomas and Harlow and Caldwell Industries, and who could therefore not be used as a pressure point or a source of information by anyone connected to what had just happened. Dana answered on the third ring. It was nearly 1 a.m. She did not ask what was wrong. She said, "Where are you?" Eleanor told her. Dana said, "Do not leave. I am coming right now." Eleanor sat down on a plastic chair near the door and held a paper towel against her ear and waited. Dana drove through the entire night without stopping and pulled into the gas station parking lot before sunrise. She got out of the car and looked at her sister standing under the fluorescent light with dried blood on her face and the particular stillness of someone who has already made the decision not to fall apart. She did not ask a single question. She opened the passenger door. Eleanor got in. They drove to Fort Worth in the dark, and neither of them spoke. While Eleanor was at Dana's apartment in Fort Worth, Richard Harlow was not idle. A death certificate for Eleanor May Caldwell was filed with the Travis County Clerk's office 5 days after the accident on the highway. It listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma sustained in a motor vehicle collision and included a date and location consistent with the accident, but vague enough to resist easy verification. It bore the signature of a physician named Dr. Gerald Mays, who operated a small private practice in a suburb of Austin and who had received a wire transfer of $18,000 from a Shell account 3 days before he signed the certificate. The body that Thomas Caldwell identified as his wife's in a county facility on the outskirts of Austin had belonged to a woman who died in an unrelated incident 3 weeks earlier, obtained through a contact at the county morgue who had been useful to Whitfield's network on previous occasions. Thomas stood in that room under the fluorescent lights and looked at a stranger on a steel table and said, "Yes, this is my wife." He signed the identification form. He drove home. 2 weeks after that, he sat in the front pew of a church in Austin with his 9-year-old daughter beside him and received the condolences of neighbors and colleagues and family friends who had loved Eleanor genuinely and who wept for her openly in the way people weep when they believe someone is truly gone. The casket at the front of the church was empty. Thomas Caldwell knew it was empty. He held his daughter's hand throughout the service. He stared at the front of the church, and whatever was occurring inside him in that moment, he kept it completely and entirely to himself. Eleanor spent 6 days at Dana's apartment in Fort Worth. The cut above her ear closed and stopped needing the bandage by the 3rd day. She discovered on the 2nd day that her bank accounts had been frozen, which she had expected and which confirmed for her that the timeline of what Harlow was doing was moving faster than she had time to counter from where she was. She had no accessible money. She had no valid identification that would survive any real scrutiny. As far as every official record in the state of Texas was concerned, she was dead, which meant she had no legal standing to file anything, contest anything, or access any institutional support that required documentation. She sat at Dana's kitchen table on the 5th day and opened the fireproof box and read through every document inside it, and she made a decision. The decision was not to fight today, because today she did not have the resources to fight effectively. The decision was to survive today and preserve the evidence and keep building what was in the box and wait for the moment when the two things, surviving and fighting, could happen at the same time. She told Dana she had to leave. Dana said she did not care about the risk to herself. Eleanor looked at her sister and said, "I do." She packed everything she had into a single bag on a November morning. She told Dana not to contact her and not to tell anyone she had been there and not to look for her, that she would come back when it was safe. Dana stood in the doorway of the apartment and watched her sister walk away down the street with a bag over her shoulder and a fireproof box under her arm and the key on the cord already around her neck. She did not hear from Eleanor again for 11 years. When she finally did, it was a postcard with no return address and no explanation. For words in her sister's handwriting. "I am still here." The name Eleanor Caldwell chose for herself was Carol Marsh, taken from an obituary in a newspaper that had been left on a bench outside the Fort Worth bus station on the morning she left Dana's apartment. Carol Marsh had been 41 years old. She had died of a sudden illness. The obituary mentioned no surviving family and no children, and a birth year close enough to Eleanor's own that the name would be workable in the kinds of situations Eleanor was now going to be living in, which were situations where people used names casually and did not ask for documentation. She used it everywhere that did not require documents. She avoided everywhere that did. She found work in a warehouse outside Fort Worth sorting overnight inventory for a company that paid its casual labor in cash on Friday afternoons and did not require anything beyond showing up and being reliable. She rented a room in a boarding house on the south side of the city for $40 a week. The room had a bed and a window and a shared bathroom down the hall, and smelled of other people's cooking and the particular closeness of spaces where people come to disappear. She kept the fireproof box under the floorboard beneath the bed. She kept the key on a cord around her neck every hour of every day without exception. She did not remove it to shower. She did not remove it to sleep. It was the one thing in her life she was certain beyond all doubt she could not afford to lose. Everything else she had could be replaced or done without. The box and the key could not. She moved 11 times in the first 4 years. Not all of those moves were by choice. Twice she left the city because she had recognized someone from her old life on the street. Once a woman she had known through the Austin school district, and once a man who had attended Caldwell Industries events and who had the kind of face that would have remembered hers. She could not afford to find out whether those sightings were coincidental, and she did not try. She packed and moved within 48 hours each time. She trusted her instincts without questioning them because her instincts were the only security system available to her. What she did not learn until decades later, when Thomas Whitfield described it in a deposition, was that Richard Harlow had in fact maintained a monitoring arrangement through a private contractor for the first 7 years after her disappearance. The contractor had been running her physical description through shelter intake records, social service databases, community health clinic logs, and outreach worker reports across Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, and Houston. He had come close twice. Both times Eleanor was already gone before he could confirm anything. She had always moved at the right moment. She had always trusted the pull in her chest that said it was time to leave before the evidence told her it was time to leave. She made herself one rule in the first year, and she held to it with the discipline of a woman who understood that the rule was the difference between functional and destroyed. She did not allow herself to think about Victoria every day. She had seen, in the first weeks, what happened when she let herself think about her daughter without limits. And what happened was that she became unable to get out of bed and unable to eat and unable to think about anything except the specific face of a 9-year-old girl in a black dress standing at a graveside and the absolute impossibility of what had been done to both of them. She could not afford to be unable to function. She permitted herself to think about Victoria on Sundays. She sat wherever she was, in whatever room or shelter or outdoor bench or doorway was available, and she allowed herself to remember the specific weight of Victoria as a newborn in the crook of her arm. The way Victoria had mispronounced certain words until she was 6 and had become furious when anyone found it endearing. The smell of her hair after a bath. The drawing she had made for Eleanor's last birthday, a horse with 6 legs and a sun that took up the entire upper half of the page, which had been taped to the refrigerator in the kitchen of the house in the hills outside Austin, and which was probably still there, taped to the refrigerator of a house Eleanor was never going to go back to. She held all of it on Sundays. She cried if she needed to cry. Then she put it back away and got up and went back to the week. It was the only way she had found to honor what she had lost without being consumed by the loss entirely. In the 4th year she was living in San Antonio, working night shifts as a commercial office cleaner for a building services company that paid cash biweekly and employed a rotating crew of workers, most of whom were not particularly interested in knowing each other's histories. The work suited her. It was physical enough to exhaust her body so that she could sleep during the day. It required no conversation beyond the practical. The supervisors did a walkthrough twice a shift and otherwise left the crew alone. She was invisible in the specific way she needed to be. One afternoon, she went to the main branch of the public library, which she visited regularly but carefully, always using a guest terminal that did not require login credentials, and she typed the name Caldwell Industries into the search bar almost without deciding to. The company had been mentioned in the business pages. A logistics contract with a federal agency. There was a photograph taken at a corporate announcement. Victoria was in the photograph. She would have been 13 years old. She was standing at the edge of the frame in the way teenagers stand at adult events, present but not quite inhabiting the space, and she had a look on her face that Eleanor recognized immediately because it was a look she had seen in the mirror her entire adult life. the look of someone who is paying much more attention than they are letting on. Eleanor sat at that terminal for a long time and looked at her daughter's face. Then she printed the photograph. She folded it in quarters and put it in her coat pocket. That evening she placed it in the fireproof box. She told herself it was just one photograph, and she was not starting a collection. Over the next 18 years, she printed 47 of them. She added to the fireproof box consistently across all 22 years. Not just the photographs. Any public document she could find that connected to Harlow's network of shell companies. Any newspaper or business journal mention of Caldwell Industries or of Richard Harlow's expanding civic influence in Dallas. She printed his charity gala photographs from library computers and placed them at the back of the box in a manila envelope she labeled with nothing. She did not need a label. She knew exactly what they were evidence of. They were evidence of a man performing generosity and trustworthiness and civic virtue in public while she slept in rented rooms and washed other people's office floors in the dark. She kept them because she had never stopped believing that one day the distance between what Richard Harlow appeared to be and what he actually was would matter to someone with the institutional power and the will to act on it. She did not know when that day was coming. She had no timeline and no plan beyond the daily one, which was survive today and protect the box and keep building what is inside it. But she was always building. Even on the worst mornings, the ones where the distance between what her life was and what it should have been was so vast she could not look at it directly, she kept adding to the box. Because the box was the one thing that connected the life she had been forced into to the truth that still existed underneath it, and she was not going to let that connection break. By 2006, Richard Harlow had ended the monitoring arrangement. He had made a calculation, the kind of calculation that powerful men make when a problem has been quiet for long enough, that Eleanor no longer posed any credible threat to him. A woman living under a false name with no financial history, no legal standing, no institutional connections, and no documentation of her own identity was not, in his assessment, someone who could mount any kind of effective challenge against a man with his legal resources and his reputation and his 30 years of carefully cultivated community trust. He filed Eleanor Caldwell into the category of problems that had been adequately managed and redirected his attention to other things. He attended galas. He made donations. He gave speeches about the importance of integrity in professional life. He appeared in business journals. He shook hands with senators. And Eleanor Caldwell, in a series of rented rooms in Texas cities he never thought about, kept adding pages to the fireproof box and kept the key around her neck and kept going. It was the most consequential miscalculation of his life. Because what Harlow's neat and self-reassuring calculation had not accounted for was the specific and absolute nature of what Eleanor Caldwell was doing with the time he had decided to stop paying attention to. She was not merely surviving. She was building the case that was going to end him. One document at a time. One library visit at a time. One carefully folded page at a time. In the 12th year, Eleanor ended up in Dallas. She had not planned it as a destination specifically. She had been moving along a circuit that kept her in Texas because leaving felt like crossing a line she was not ready to cross. Some residual and probably irrational belief that proximity to the city where her daughter was building her life was better than distance from it, even if she could do nothing with the proximity. Dallas was large enough to provide genuine anonymity and familiar enough in its basic geography to feel navigable. She found a drop-in center on the south side that offered meals, laundry access, and a computer terminal without requiring documentation or identification. The staff knew her as Carol. She helped serve lunch on Thursdays without being asked to. She was reliable and quiet and kept herself apart from the other people who used the center in a way that one of the staff members, a young woman named Rosa, who later gave a statement to investigators, described as patient. Not withdrawn, Rosa said. Not sad in the way a lot of people are sad here. Patient. Like someone who was waiting for something specific and was prepared to wait as long as it took. Rosa was right. Eleanor was waiting. She could not have told you precisely what she was waiting for. But something in her had never stopped moving toward it. Slowly, carefully, without announcing itself, moving nonetheless. It was on the drop-in center's computer terminal that Eleanor found the Forbes profile on Victoria. Victoria was 36 years old in the photograph on the cover. She was standing in front of the Caldwell Industries headquarters building in downtown Dallas. a building Eleanor had never seen in person but had looked at many times on a screen. Victoria had the look of someone who has recently understood that the camera is not a threat and has decided to simply inhabit the frame without negotiating with it. She looked strong. She looked certain. She had the particular set of the jaw that Eleanor recognized from her own mother. Eleanor read the entire profile twice, sitting at the terminal in the drop-in center with the sound of lunch service behind her and the smell of industrial cleaner from the mopped floor beside the desk. She read the line about Victoria being raised primarily by her father following the death of her mother when Victoria was 9 years old, and she sat with that sentence for a very long time. She understood what it had cost. She understood it in the particular and specific way that you understand something when you are the absence the sentence is describing. She printed the photograph and the profile. She folded them and placed them in the box beside the other 46. Then she walked back to the shelter in the early evening dark and sat on her cot and thought about the fact that her daughter's office was 3 miles from where she was sitting. 3 miles. She thought about that distance for a long time. She made no move. The moment was not right. She did not yet have the means to make the moment anything other than another loss she could not afford. But something in her that had been very still for a long time had begun, with great care and great patience, to shift. The morning Eleanor ended up on Meridian Street was not chosen. A shelter she used regularly had closed for emergency repairs 2 weeks earlier, and she had been rotating between less familiar spots. Meridian Street was on the walking route between the drop-in center and a church on 5th that opened at 7 on weekday mornings for coffee and a hot meal. She had sat against the wall of that particular laundromat several times before. The overhang above the door kept the rain off. The building's position on the block provided some shelter from the prevailing wind. She was sitting there on a Tuesday morning in October, holding her paper cup and waiting for the church to open when a black car stopped at a red light at the corner of Meridian and 5th and did not move when the light turned green. She did not look up immediately. She had learned not to look up at cars that paused near where she was sitting because looking up was the beginning of an interaction she could not always predict or control. But the car did not move when the light changed again. And then the door opened, and footsteps crossed the pavement toward her in a way that was different from the footsteps that usually came in her direction. Purposeful, but not aggressive, not the footsteps of someone with a uniform or a form to fill out. And then a voice said her name. Not Carol Marsh. Not a version of Carol Marsh. Her name. Eleanor. The sound of her own name spoken out loud by a voice she had not heard in 30 years landed somewhere below language and below reasoning, in the part of a person that does not process sound so much as receive it. She closed her eyes. She felt the key against her chest through her shirt. She exhaled. And then she opened her eyes and looked up at her daughter's face for the first time in 22 years. Victoria sat across from her mother in the hotel room and listened without interrupting for 6 hours. Eleanor did not editorialize. She did not perform her suffering or seek visible sympathy or frame what had happened to her in any way that asked for a particular response. She simply reported every date, every name, every account number and account transfer and forged document and closed door. The specific name of the highway outside Austin. The specific date of the death certificate filing. The name of the physician who had signed a document for $18,000 about a woman who was sitting 3 feet away describing it 22 years later. When Eleanor finished speaking, she reached into the bag she had brought with her, the same worn canvas bag she had been carrying for years, and she placed the fireproof box on the table between them. She removed the key from the cord around her neck. Her hands were completely steady. She unlocked the box. She opened the lid. She pushed the box across the table to Victoria. She said, "Everything is in there. Every document I found in 1999. Every copy I made. Every page I have added since then. It has been waiting for this moment since the night I put the first page inside it. 22 years of evidence sitting in a box the size of a shoebox that a woman had carried from city to city and room to room under her arm and kept with the key around her neck because she had never been willing to let the truth go, even when letting the truth go would have been considerably easier than keeping it. Victoria did not open the box that first night. Eleanor fell asleep in the chair across from her sometime after midnight with the particular sudden heaviness of someone whose body has been running on something other than rest for longer than it should have and has finally been given permission to stop. Victoria got up quietly and took the blanket from the bed and covered her mother with it. She stood beside the chair for a moment and looked at her mother's sleeping face. Then she sat down at the table and opened the box. She read until the sun came up. She read her mother's original spiral-bound notebook from 1999, the handwriting precise and completely calm in a way that took her breath away, because she understood what it had cost a woman in that situation, in those circumstances, to write with that kind of precision. She traced the account numbers against her own knowledge of Caldwell Industries' financial records, the records she had inherited when she took over the company after her father's death, and had spent years trying to fully understand. She began to see the full architecture of what Harlow had built, and it was not simply the fraud. Though the fraud was substantial, it was the deliberate and patient construction of a world in which her mother could not exist, and in which Victoria would never think to look for her. She read every document Eleanor had added over 22 years. Every clipping, every filing, every photograph of Richard Harlow printed from a library computer and placed in a manila envelope. And then she came to the photographs of herself. 47 of them, printed and folded and carried in this box through every city and every rented room, and every cold morning for 18 years by a woman who could not be her mother in person and had decided that was not going to stop her from knowing who her daughter was becoming. Victoria put the box down on the table. She sat very still for a long time. Outside the window, the Dallas skyline began to catch the first light. She looked at it, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and she stayed that way until she was ready to pick the box back up and keep reading. It took a while. When the sun was fully up, Victoria called Margaret Voss. Margaret had been her attorney for 9 years and was one of the few people in Victoria's professional world that Victoria trusted at the level this situation required. She met her at a private office space Margaret maintained for sensitive client work, away from the main firm. She laid the entire picture across the conference table. Every document from the box. Eleanor's full 6-hour account reconstructed in the notes Victoria had kept through the night. The names. The timeline. The specific financial architecture of what Harlow had done. Margaret listened without a word. When Victoria finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone who is not assembling a response, but absorbing information that has weight. Then she said, "There are things about your mother's case that I have known about for a long time and have not told you, and I need to tell you now." Years earlier, while reviewing legacy files at her previous firm during a business acquisition process, Margaret had encountered anomalies in the death certificate documentation for Eleanor May Caldwell. The processing sequence had been irregular. The timeline of the filing relative to the reported accident had been too fast. She had flagged it for the senior partner at the time and had been told quietly but firmly to file it and forget it and move on. The name of that senior partner was Gerald Whitmore. Gerald Whitmore had been Richard Harlow's personal attorney for 31 years. Margaret looked across the conference table at Victoria and said, "I should have done more than flag it. I have known that for a long time." Victoria looked back at her and said, "You can do it now." That ended the conversation about the past. Everything after that was forward. Victoria engaged a private investigator named James Rourke, who had spent 20 years building complex corporate fraud cases and whose name had come to her through a source she trusted completely. She gave Rourke 3 names and told him to move fast, and to move quietly, and to report only to her directly, and to no one else. He came back within 72 hours. Dr. Gerald Mays had lost his medical license in 2004 under circumstances the state board described as professional misconduct related to documentation irregularities. He was 81 years old and living in a retirement community in New Mexico in poor health. Thomas Whitfield was the more consequential finding. According to Rourke's contacts within federal law enforcement, Whitfield had been living since 2007 under an informal arrangement with a federal agency, the product of his cooperation in an unrelated financial crimes investigation. He was not in formal witness protection. He was not unreachable. And Rourke's assessment, based on the specificity of what he had been able to find about Whitfield's activities in the years since 2007, was that Whitfield had been waiting for a long time for someone with enough standing, enough resources, and enough documented evidence to make it genuinely worth his while to tell everything he knew. Victoria drove herself to meet Thomas Whitfield on a Thursday morning. No lawyer in the car. No driver. She had considered bringing Margaret and decided against it. She wanted to read this man without the structure of a formal legal meeting in the room with them, and she trusted herself to do that better alone. She met him at a diner 40 miles outside Dallas at 7 in the morning. He was smaller than she had expected from Rourke's description. A compact, quiet man in his late 60s with the particular stillness of someone who has been living carefully and quietly for a very long time, and has become so practiced at taking up as little space as possible that it has become simply how he exists. He ordered coffee and did not drink it. He looked at Victoria across the table for a full minute without speaking. Then he said, "I wondered when this day would come. I am glad it has." He talked for 3 hours. He described the arrangement with Harlow in the order in which it had developed: the phone call, the payment, the truck, the forged authorization documents for the bank accounts, the physician, the contact at the morgue, and the 7-year monitoring arrangement that had tracked Eleanor across 4 Texas cities. He described all of it in the flat, precise language of a man who has been carrying a detailed internal record for a very long time, and is finally being given permission to set it down somewhere outside himself. When he finished speaking, Victoria said, "What about my father?" Whitfield looked at the surface of the table. Victoria said it again, more slowly and more specifically. "Tell me what happened to my father." Whitfield reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper that was worn at the creases from years of being opened and folded and opened again. He placed it on the table and slid it across to her without speaking. On it was a name, a pharmacist in Austin. He said, 2 years before Thomas died, he came to me. He had worked it out that Eleanor was alive. He wanted to find her. He told Harlow he was going to the authorities, and he was done with all of it. Whitfield paused. He looked at the table. Then he said, "Richard Harlow could not allow that." The diner was very quiet. Victoria picked up the piece of paper. She looked at the name on it. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She sat very still for a long time before she said anything else. Thomas Caldwell had died at 58 years old alone in his home study on a Wednesday evening in the spring of 2003. The cause of death on his certificate was acute myocardial infarction. He had a documented history of high blood pressure. He had worked long hours for decades. He had never been careful about his health in any of the ways that doctors recommend for men in their 50s with elevated blood pressure and high-stress professional lives. The physicians who reviewed the case at the time saw a picture that, while sad, was not unusual and did not require further inquiry. But the pharmacist whose name was on the piece of paper Whitfield had handed Victoria across that diner table had been filling prescriptions for the Caldwell household for years. Beginning in the late fall of 2001, approximately 2 months after Thomas Caldwell had gone to Whitfield and said he wanted out of everything, that pharmacist had been making small and technically undetectable adjustments to the composition of Thomas Caldwell's prescribed blood pressure medication. The adjustments were not dramatic. They were the kind of adjustments that required specific pharmaceutical knowledge to make, and that would produce, not immediately but over months, a gradual deterioration in the function of a cardiovascular system that was already working harder than it should. Thomas Caldwell had gone to his study on a Wednesday evening in the spring of 2003, feeling unwell, and had not come out again. Victoria had found him the next morning. She had stood in the doorway of his study at 27 years old, and the grief of it had merged with the grief she had been carrying since she was 9, and she had made the decision she always made with grief, which was to convert it into something that could move forward rather than something that would stop her where she stood. She had built $400 million out of it. Every dollar of it on a foundation that Richard Harlow had constructed and then poisoned, and then continued to collect from while attending her father's funeral and shaking her hand at board meetings and calling himself her mentor. Before Victoria took the evidence to the district attorney, she ran one final test inside her own organization. Whitfield had mentioned, carefully and without identifying a specific person, that someone currently working within Victoria's company was reporting her movements and decisions to Harlow's network. This arrangement had been put in place approximately 18 months earlier. Victoria designed a controlled information test. She prepared 3 different and mutually incompatible descriptions of her next planned move in the Harlow situation and shared each version separately with a different senior staff member in the context of what appeared to be a confidential strategy discussion. She then created conditions under which, if any of those descriptions reached Harlow's network, she would be able to identify the source. Within 48 hours, Harlow's attorney had made a telephone call that was legally intercepted by Rourke's team, and that contained specific details corresponding precisely to one of the 3 versions. The source was Victoria's head of corporate security, a man named Dale Pruitt who had joined the company 18 months earlier on the basis of a letter of recommendation that, when traced back 2 professional steps, originated from a consulting firm that maintained a professional relationship with one of Harlow's subsidiary holding companies. Pruitt was escorted from the Caldwell Industries building by 2 members of staff before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. When he reached the lobby, he asked for his attorney's phone number. He denied nothing. He explained nothing. He had been prepared for exactly this conversation, which told Victoria that Richard Harlow had also been preparing for it. She had simply moved first. Richard Harlow was 67 years old at the time of his arrest, and had spent 4 full decades constructing a public identity that the city of Dallas found not merely credible, but deeply admirable. A wing of the Children's Hospital carried his name on a brass plaque at the entrance. He held seats on the boards of 3 established charitable foundations. He gave keynote addresses at business ethics conferences where audiences of several hundred professionals listened to him speak about the importance of integrity and accountability in commercial life. He attended civic dinners with senators and mayors and corporate executives who considered him a friend and who called him by his first name and returned his calls the same day. He had been profiled in the Dallas Business Journal 3 times in 20 years, each profile describing him in terms like self-made and visionary and community anchor. He had become, through sustained effort across decades, so woven into the fabric of the city's institutional life that his name on a donor list or on a board roster or in a press release about a civic initiative was not just acceptable, but desirable. People sought his association. Organizations welcomed his involvement. And every photograph and every speech and every charitable gift and every firm handshake with a person of influence was the performance of a man who had been stealing from a family and arranging the destruction of human lives for 30 years without a single consequence. The performance was that sustained. The cover was that complete. What Harlow had understood from the very beginning of the scheme was that the most powerful protection available to a man doing what he was doing was not distance or secrecy or technical sophistication, though he had all 3. It was trust. Absolute, earned, maintained trust. Build enough of it, and enough of the right people, and those people will not believe the evidence against you even when they are looking directly at it. The forensic accountants working with the district attorney's office spent 4 months reconstructing the full financial picture. The total amount diverted from Caldwell Industries through the Meridian Logistics Solutions arrangement and a series of related shell company structures over 3 decades was approximately $14 million. Some of that money had been laundered through layers of legitimate business transactions into Harlow's acknowledged holdings in ways that a forensic team could trace, but that would have been completely invisible to a casual observer or a non-specialized audit. Some of it had been used to fund the operation against Eleanor, including the payments to Whitfield, the physician, the morgue contact, the document processing firm, and the private monitoring contractor who had tracked Eleanor across 4 Texas cities for 7 years. The remainder had funded a personal lifestyle that required, year over year, considerably more money than Harlow's documented legitimate income could have supported. The charity donations were not separate from the fraud. They were part of it. The man who had spoken at ethics conferences about the responsibilities of success had built his public reputation for generosity using money he had stolen from a family whose surviving member was running the company he had stolen it from. The performance and the crime were not separate things. They were the same thing. Harlow had known something was coming for at least 2 weeks before the morning of his arrest. His attorney would later acknowledge in a disbarment proceeding that Harlow had made a series of specific and pointed inquiries in the days after Victoria Caldwell stopped returning his calls, asking about statutes of limitations on financial fraud of the type involved in corporate shell company arrangements, and about the legal process for challenging a death certificate that had been filed decades earlier under potentially irregular circumstances. His attorney claimed he had answered those questions without understanding their full context. On the morning of the arrest, Harlow was attending a charity breakfast for the Dallas Children's Foundation at a hotel ballroom in downtown Dallas. The event had been in his diary for months. The room held approximately 90 people. Hospital administrators and foundation board members and corporate sponsors, and elected officials and civic leaders who had known Richard Harlow for years and who had, in many cases, accepted his donations and attended his dinners and praised his contributions to the life of their city. Federal agents arrived at 8:47 in the morning. Harlow was standing near the buffet with a glass of orange juice in his hand, having a conversation with the deputy director of a literacy nonprofit. He was handcuffed in front of all 90 of them in complete silence. Someone at the back of the room dropped a plate. The sound of it hitting the floor was the only thing that happened for 3 full seconds after the agents announced his name. 3 seconds of absolute silence in a room full of people who had trusted him completely. That silence was its own kind of verdict. Victoria was not at the breakfast. She was sitting in the hotel room with her mother, in the same 2 chairs by the window where they had sat 6 hours of truth ago, drinking coffee from the room service tray that had arrived at 7. She was reading through a document on her phone when Margaret called. She looked at the name and answered immediately. Margaret said 3 words. "He is arrested." Victoria set the phone face down on the table. She looked across at her mother. Eleanor was holding her coffee cup in both hands and looking at the morning light on the Dallas skyline through the window. She did not speak immediately. She held the cup and she looked at the skyline for a long time. Then she said, "I never stopped believing this would happen. I just ran out of believing it would happen while I was still alive to see it." Victoria reached across the small table and placed her hand over her mother's. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Outside the window, the city moved forward in the ordinary, indifferent way it moves on ordinary mornings, full of traffic and noise, and the particular momentum of a large American city that has no idea what is happening in a hotel room on the 14th floor. But in that room, 2 women who had been separated by 22 years of deliberate and funded cruelty were sitting in the morning light with their hands touching on a table between them. And the silence between them was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of something that had finally, after all of it, after every single thing it had cost, arrived. The charges against Richard Harlow were filed in 5 counts. Conspiracy to commit fraud through the systematic financial crimes against Caldwell Industries spanning 3 decades. Obstruction of justice through the documented suppression of Eleanor Caldwell's 2002 police report, accomplished through Harlow's legal network and evidenced in communications recovered from Gerald Whitmore's firm's archived files. Conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Thomas Caldwell, supported by Whitfield's testimony and financial records connecting Harlow's accounts to the intermediary chain that led to Robert Dean. Identity fraud through the preparation and filing of a false death certificate, and witness intimidation through the 7-year monitoring arrangement. The evidence package Margaret Voss delivered to the district attorney's office ran to 417 pages. The lead prosecutor on the case, a woman named Dana Ferris who had been with the DA's office for 19 years, said afterward in a recorded interview that in her career she had never received a privately assembled evidentiary package of this completeness. She said it was as though someone had been building the case from the inside for decades. Someone had. The trial lasted 11 weeks and was covered by every major news organization in Texas and several national ones. The courtroom was full every day of the proceedings. The story had the specific combination of elements that holds public attention across many weeks, a prominent and admired defendant whose reputation made the charges feel impossible until the evidence made them feel inevitable. A victim who had survived 2 decades of deliberate erasure and had walked into a witness box to give her account in full. A daughter who had built a significant fortune on the foundation of a lie she had been handed as a child, and who had then dismantled that lie with the same methodical precision she brought to every other professional challenge in her life. And beneath all of it, a question that the city of Dallas could not entirely avoid looking at, which was the question of how many people across 30 years had noticed something about Richard Harlow that did not quite add up, and had decided that noticing was not the same as being required to do anything about it. Whitfield testified for 3 days. He was composed and specific and held firm on every material factual point under sustained cross-examination by Harlow's defense team. The defense characterized him as a man who had committed serious crimes himself and was trading his testimony for immunity. The jury had 417 pages of documentary evidence that corroborated every specific claim he made about dates and amounts and arrangements and payments. Dr. Gerald Mays provided a written statement from New Mexico read into the record by the prosecution, acknowledging his role in signing the fraudulent certificate and identifying the payment he had received. Robert Dean, the pharmacist, testified in person over the course of a full day. He described in clinical and pharmaceutical detail the specific adjustments he had made to Thomas Caldwell's prescribed medication over 18 months and the expected physiological effect of those adjustments on a patient with Thomas Caldwell's documented cardiovascular history. The courtroom was very quiet for the entirety of his testimony. Not because his language was dramatic, because the jury was understanding, in real time, that what he was describing in technical and clinical language was the slow, deliberate, carefully calibrated killing of a man who had tried too late to do the right thing. And that understanding sat in the room for the rest of the trial like something that could not be put back. Eleanor Caldwell testified for one day. She sat in the witness box in a courtroom that was full of cameras and journalists and city officials and lawyers and members of the public who had followed the case from the beginning and who had come specifically to see her. She wore a dark blue dress that Victoria had brought her the morning of her testimony. She sat straight in the chair. She put her hands on the railing in front of her, and she left them there. She spoke quietly and without hesitation in complete sentences that required no clarification or follow-up from the prosecutor, in the way that testimony requires follow-up, when the witness has not had decades to understand every element of what they are describing. She started at the beginning. She went to the end. In the same careful order she had carried inside herself through every shelter and every rented room, in every city, and every cold morning on every street, she had walked down across 22 years telling herself the box was worth protecting, and therefore, she was worth protecting. She looked at Richard Harlow once at the very start of her testimony. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did not look at him again. She looked at the jury. She looked at the prosecutor. She looked at the judge. She gave the court everything it needed to do its job. Then she stepped down from the witness box and walked back to her seat and sat very still with her hands folded in her lap while the room around her tried, in real time, to absorb what it had just been given. The jury deliberated for 14 hours. When the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom was completely silent. Observers in the back row of the gallery said afterward they could hear Eleanor Caldwell exhale from across the room when the first count was read. Richard Harlow was found guilty on all 5 counts. He received a sentence of 34 years in federal custody. His attorneys filed an appeal the same afternoon the sentence was delivered. The appeal was denied 18 months later by the appellate court without comment. Dale Pruitt, Victoria's former head of corporate security, pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received 4 years. Gerald Whitmore was disbarred following a state bar inquiry that found he had possessed material knowledge relevant to the Eleanor Caldwell case for years and had deliberately withheld it, though he avoided criminal charges. Dr. Gerald Mays received a suspended sentence given his age and the early nature of his cooperation with investigators. Robert Dean received 7 years. Thomas Whitfield received full immunity in exchange for his testimony and was relocated under an arrangement the relevant federal agency declined to describe in any public filing. The last sentence in the case was handed down to Dean 16 months after Harlow's conviction. When it was done, the case Eleanor Caldwell had been building from public library terminals and drop-in center computers across the state of Texas for 22 years was complete. Every count, every name. It was done. There was one revelation the trial produced that no one had fully prepared for. It arrived in the 3rd week of proceedings when Harlow's defense team filed a supporting evidentiary motion that included, as one of its attached documents, a private written agreement dated to the fall of 1998. The document was signed by Thomas Caldwell. It outlined a formal arrangement between Thomas Caldwell and Richard Harlow under which Thomas Caldwell acknowledged explicit awareness of the Meridian Logistics Solutions transfers and the financial arrangement underlying them, and agreed, in exchange for a guaranteed buyout of his shares in Caldwell Industries at double their current market value, to take no action to disclose, investigate, or report the arrangement to any regulatory, legal, or law enforcement body. The signature on the document was submitted to 2 independent handwriting analysts retained by the prosecution. Both verified it as authentic. Thomas Caldwell had not been deceived by Richard Harlow. He had not discovered the fraud late and been manipulated into silence. He had known. He had negotiated a price for his silence. He had signed an agreement. He had come home the same year and told his wife she had misunderstood what she was looking at. He had sat in a cold room and identified a stranger as his wife. He had held his 9-year-old daughter's hand at a funeral he knew was built on a fabrication he had helped finance. And he had received the money. And then, 2 years before he died, something had changed. No one who testified in the trial could say with certainty what had changed it. Whitfield described it simply as Thomas coming to him and saying he wanted out of everything and that he intended to find Eleanor and go to the authorities. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was fear of what he had become. Perhaps it was the specific weight of watching his daughter grow up carrying a grief that he knew was based on a lie and understanding that the longer the lie continued, the more it cost her and the more it would eventually cost both of them. Whatever it was that changed in Thomas Caldwell in the 2 years before his death, it had changed enough that he was willing to risk everything to undo what he had agreed to. And it had cost him his life. The man Victoria had spent 30 years grieving was both the man who had failed his wife in a way that no amount of eventual regret could undo and the man who had eventually tried, at the price of everything he had left, to correct what that failure had made possible. Both of those things were simultaneously true. Neither one canceled the other out. Victoria Caldwell sat in that courtroom and heard the 1998 agreement read into the official record and had to find a way, in real time, in a room full of cameras and journalists and the eyes of everyone who had followed this case, to hold both of those truths at the same time. Her attorney released one statement on her behalf. It said, "The full complexity of what was done to my family is something I am still in the process of understanding, and I ask for privacy while I do." That was all she said publicly. It was, given the circumstances, exactly enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What people who were close to Victoria described in the months that followed was not anything as clean as collapse or resolution. It was something quieter and in certain respects harder than either of those things. She had organized the last 30 years of her professional and personal life around the foundation of honoring the memory of her father. The drive that had rebuilt Caldwell Industries, the late nights and the difficult negotiations, and the refusal to accept any outcome she had not decided to accept, had all been built on that foundation, on the idea of continuing something he had started and making it worthy of the loss. The foundation had turned out to be incomplete, not fabricated, but incomplete in ways that required her to look directly at things she had spent 30 years not looking at. Thomas Caldwell had loved his daughter. That was real. He had also made a choice in 1998 that had cost his wife 22 years of her life and his daughter 30 years of a lie. And his eventual decision to reverse that choice had come too late to prevent any of what it had set in motion. Victoria had to find a way to hold all of that at once, the love and the failure and the too late courage, and to build something from it that was honest rather than simply comfortable. People who knew her said it was the hardest thing they had seen her do. And they had watched her do hard things for a long time. She did it because she was Eleanor Caldwell's daughter as much as she was Thomas Caldwell's. And Eleanor had taught her, not in any speech or lesson, but simply by surviving and by keeping the box and by never putting down the key, that the truth does not need to be clean or simple or comfortable. It only needs to be faced. And Victoria Caldwell had never in her life been a woman who looked away from what needed to be faced. Eleanor Caldwell's identity was legally restored 7 months after Richard Harlow's arrest. The process required filings in 3 separate Texas counties, sworn testimony from Dana about the circumstances of Eleanor's departure from Fort Worth in November 1999, and a DNA comparison against dental and medical records that confirmed what was already evident to everyone involved. The woman who had been living as Carol Marsh for 22 years was Eleanor May Caldwell, born in Dallas, Texas, a living person with a legal right to her own name and her own history and her own place in every record that had been altered or voided or falsified to remove her from it. She received a financial settlement drawn from Richard Harlow's seized assets. Her attorneys declined to disclose the amount in any public statement. She did not move into Victoria's home. She said she was too shaped by the person those 22 years had made her to step back into ease and comfort and proximity without it feeling like a performance of something she was not quite yet. She bought a small house in the hill country outside Austin, not far from the area where the Caldwell family home had once stood, in a location she had found herself thinking about more than once during the years she had been in Dallas and had allowed herself to think about what coming back might look like. She has a garden. tomatoes and 2 kinds of peppers, and a climbing rose that has been working its way steadily up the back fence since the first spring after she moved in. Victoria visits every Sunday when she is in the country. She restructured her travel calendar to ensure she is in the country most Sundays. She has not missed one yet. In the year following the trial, Caldwell Industries established a new initiative through its charitable foundation. The initiative provides legal identity restoration services and targeted financial support to individuals who are living under assumed names or with fraudulently destroyed identities as a result of domestic abuse, financial coercion, or deliberate identity destruction of the kind Eleanor experienced. The program helps people navigate the specific and often genuinely difficult legal and bureaucratic process of reclaiming their own names, reaccessing financial and social service systems from which they have been excluded, and establishing the documentation they need to exist fully and legally as themselves in the world. It operates out of dedicated offices in Dallas, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio, and in its first 3 years of operation, it has assisted more than 600 individuals through the restoration process. It is called the Eleanor Program. It does not advertise its existence. It does not hold galas or seek media coverage or put photographs of its leadership on any public-facing materials. It simply does the work, quietly and consistently, in the same way that Eleanor Caldwell herself survived for 22 years. One person at a time, without announcement. Because the work is the point. Dana, Eleanor's sister, gave one interview in the year following the verdict. She was asked what the 11 years of silence had been like. The years between Eleanor walking away from her apartment in Fort Worth in November 1999 and the postcard that arrived one morning with no return address and no explanation. Dana was quiet for a moment before answering. Then she said, "I got one postcard." 4 words written in her handwriting. "I am still here." I read those 4 words every single morning for 11 years. I kept the postcard on my kitchen counter where I could see it first thing when I got up. I looked at it before I made coffee, before I did anything else. Not because it told me she was safe, or that things were going to be resolved, or that she was coming back. It didn't tell me any of those things. It just told me she was still in the world. And that was enough. That was enough to get me from that morning to the next morning. And that was all I needed it to be. She stopped speaking for a moment. Then she said, "I want people to understand something from this story. Never underestimate what it costs someone just to stay alive when the world has been arranged against them. And never stop looking for the people you love, even when the looking seems like it is not going anywhere. Keep looking." Victoria gave one formal interview in the 18 months following the verdict. She answered questions about the company and the investigation and the legal proceedings with her characteristic brevity and composure. She said what needed to be said about each topic and did not elaborate where elaboration was not required. But toward the end of the conversation, the journalist asked her what she thought about when she thought about her mother during the years of separation. The years, specifically, when Eleanor had been 3 miles from Victoria's office and Victoria had not known. Victoria was quiet for a moment that the journalist described in the published piece as unlike her other pauses, heavier somehow, occupying more space. Then Victoria said, "I think about her at a library computer. I think about her typing my name into a search engine and finding a photograph of me and printing it on a library printer and folding it carefully and putting it in her coat pocket. I think about her carrying 47 photographs of me in a fireproof box across 22 years of living in ways that should have been impossible to survive, because she could not be my mother in person, but she was not going to stop knowing who I was becoming. I was building a company. I was telling myself I had processed my grief and become someone who did not need what had been taken from me. I was 3 miles away from her, and I had no idea. She was carrying my photographs in a box with a key around her neck, and she was waiting. That is what I think about when I think about those years. Not him. Not any of it. Her." Eleanor was asked, separately, what she had thought about during the worst of those years. Not the practical questions of survival, which had their own daily answers, but the underneath of it, the thing that had kept her going when keeping going did not make straightforward rational sense. She said, "I thought about Victoria. Not the Victoria in the Forbes profile or in the business news. I thought about the 9-year-old girl in the black dress at the graveside. I have thought about that girl every single day for 22 years. Every single morning when I woke up in a room that was not mine and picked up the box and put the key around my neck and decided to keep going, I thought about her. Not about what had been done to me. Not about justice for myself. Just about my daughter standing in that churchyard needing her mother to still be in the world. And I was still in the world. I have always been still in the world. I just needed her to be able to find me. And on a Tuesday morning in October, she got out of a car on Meridian Street, and she said my name. After 22 years. She said my name. And I knew. In the same place that had recognized something when she was standing over me on the sidewalk before she even spoke, I knew. I knew that we had made it home. After everything, we had made it home. How many Eleanor Caldwells are there right now? That is the question this story leaves permanently behind. How many people are living under names that are not theirs in cities where their families are building lives they know nothing about, carrying documentation in boxes because they have never been able to stop believing that the truth is worth protecting even when protecting it costs them everything. The systems that failed Eleanor Caldwell were not unusual or broken systems. They were the ordinary systems that exist in every American city, and they failed in the ordinary ways that those systems fail when one party has resources and institutional trust and the other party has neither. What finally brought the truth to light was not a reform or a policy intervention or a moment of institutional accountability. It was a driver who took a different road on a Tuesday morning, and a daughter who looked up from her phone at precisely the right moment, and a woman who had been carrying a key around her neck for 22 years and had never once, on the hardest morning or the coldest night, or in the longest stretch of days when the distance between what her life was and what it should have been felt completely unbridgeable, put that key down. She kept it. She kept the box. She kept building what was inside it. She kept going. And when the door finally appeared, she was ready for it. She had been ready for a long time. She had simply been waiting for someone to show her where it was.